There's a moment, and you've had it, where you said yes when you meant no. Not because you were afraid, not because you didn't know better, but because something in you calculated. The salary, the approval, the peace, the path of least resistance, wearing a suit and calling itself wisdom, and you made the trade. That moment didn't feel like a surrender. It felt like a strategy. It felt like patience. It felt like the smart, adult, emotionally intelligent thing to do. But Niccolo Machiavelli, a man who watched empires collapse not from external attack, but from the internal erosion of human self-deception, identified this exact pattern 5 centuries ago. He didn't call it weakness. He didn't call it fear. He called it the quietest form of political suicide. And the uncomfortable part, he said most men never stop doing it. Not once, not twice. They build entire lives around the habit of it. Watch how it happens in slow motion. A man takes a job he doesn't want because the job he wanted felt uncertain. Not impossible, uncertain. He tells himself he'll pivot in a year. The year passes. He pivots deeper in. A woman stays in a dynamic, professional, romantic, social that consistently diminishes her because leaving requires a conversation she doesn't want to have yet. The yet lasts 4 years. These aren't dramatic stories. That's precisely the problem. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince that men are injured by 2 things, having their property taken and having their dignity insulted. But the version of this no one finishes quoting is the line where he notes that the most dangerous injuries are the ones men inflict on themselves, silently, voluntarily, in the name of prudence. The pattern is always the same, a small concession to comfort, justified with language borrowed from wisdom, repeated until it becomes an identity. There's a behavioral phenomenon social psychologists at Stanford studied in the 1970s, the foot-in-the-door compliance effect, where agreeing to small requests consistently primes people to agree to larger ones. What the original research buried in the footnotes is the inverse. Every small capitulation to your own avoidance also lowers your threshold for the next one. You don't just say yes to them, you start believing you meant to. And this is where it gets structurally dangerous. The human brain does not experience avoidance as avoidance. It experiences as analysis. When you talk yourself out of something that challenges you, it doesn't feel like retreat. It produces a sensation almost indistinguishable from clarity. This is not a metaphor. This is neurological. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for planning and decision-making, is the same architecture involved in constructing narratives about those decisions. The same system that makes the choice also writes the story about why the choice was correct. Watch someone justify a compromise they know is wrong. Their voice slows, their eye contact becomes slightly fixed. There's a rehearsed quality to the explanation, not because they're lying to you, but because they have been repeating it to themselves long enough that it has the texture of belief. Machiavelli observed this in the courts of Florence with surgical precision. He watched men of considerable intelligence construct elaborate philosophical frameworks for inaction. He watched them dress paralysis in the language of strategy. He noticed they were always the last to see what everyone around them already understood. He wrote, "Men deceive themselves into believing they can always avoid present danger by delaying it, not understanding that time does not wait and that opportunity consumed by hesitation does not return." He wasn't writing philosophy, he was writing a field report. But what made Machiavelli disturbing, what made him dangerous, wasn't what he said about weak men. It was what he said about the moment a man decides to stop. Here's the thing about patterns built over years. They don't dissolve, they break. And breaking them requires a kind of internal violence that most people mistake for recklessness. In 1997, Steve Jobs returned to Apple after being forced out of the company he founded. The board expected humility. They expected someone chastened by a decade of public failure. Instead, they got someone who had spent 10 years in the wilderness of Next and Pixar, developing an intolerance for the safe decision.
His first move back was not gradual optimization. He cut the product line from 350 items to 10. He eliminated committees. He fired people in hallways. He made enemies before he made progress. The journalists called it instability. The internal memos called it chaos. 3 years later, it was called the greatest corporate resurrection in American history. This isn't a success story, it's a behavioral study. Jobs had spent years at Next making the same mistake, building something perfect instead of building something real. He understood from the inside what the architecture of small yes decisions looks like when compounded over a decade. When he returned, he was operating from a different psychological position. He had already paid the price of compromise and watched what it built. The reversal was violent because the accumulation had been so complete. Machiavelli would have recognized it immediately. In The Prince, he argues that bold action taken at the right moment causes less total damage than cautious inaction sustained over time. The surgeon who cuts cleanly causes less harm than the surgeon who hesitates mid-operation.
The question, and this is the one that should actually disturb you, is not whether you've been making small compromises. It's what they've been building. There's a version of your life that exists in the gap between what you've decided and what you've deferred. Not a fantasy version, not a perfect version, a specific one. The project you've been pre-rejecting, the conversation you've been preparing to have, the direction you already know is yours, but keep treating it as something that needs more evidence before you pursue it. Every day you don't move toward it, you make two decisions simultaneously. The first is visible. You choose what you're doing instead. The second is invisible. You're training your nervous system to interpret the direction of your own life as optional. There's a word for this in behavioral psychology, learned helplessness. But the clinical version understates the social dimension. It's not just that you stop trying, it's that you start performing contentment for an audience that isn't watching as closely as you think. Martin Seligman's original experiments on learned helplessness were conducted on dogs in the 1960s. What the textbook summary omits is the detail that even after the conditions changed, even after the cage door was opened, the dogs stayed. Not because they couldn't leave, because they had learned to experience the cage as the complete definition of what was possible. You've seen this in some people. Someone who speaks about their ambitions in past tense, who refers to what they used to want with a tone that's not exactly grief, but adjacent to it. Who has made the architecture of the cage so familiar, so rationalized, so philosophically defended that suggesting they leave produces genuine confusion. The confusion isn't performance, and this is the part Machiavelli identified that no modern framework has improved upon. Machiavelli's central insight wasn't about power over others, it was about the war a man conducts against his own momentum. He watched Lorenzo de' Medici, one of the most gifted political minds of the Renaissance, lose Florence, not to a superior enemy, not to betrayal, but to a gradual accumulation of deferred decisions. Small agreements made to preserve comfort, alliances maintained past their useful life, the slow substitution of reputation management for actual governance. Lorenzo died at 43. Florence fell within 2 years. Machiavelli spent the following 2 decades writing, not from power, from exile. And what came out of that exile was not bitterness, it was diagnosis. He wrote, "It is not titles that honor men, but men that honor titles." That line is typically quoted in the context of leadership, but read it again more slowly. It means the role you occupy does not define what you do with it. You define it by the quality of decision you bring to it or fail to bring to it. A father, a founder, a friend, a creative, a professional. These aren't identities you receive, they are identities you continuously construct or continuously abandon, one decision at a time in the direction of your actual values or your immediate comfort. The pattern Machiavelli identified, the one this entire video has been circling, is not weakness. Weakness can be corrected. This pattern is preference disguised as circumstance, and the correction for it is not motivation, it is not discipline, it is not a morning routine. The correction is a single, quiet act of honesty that most people spend their entire lives avoiding.
asking yourself, at what point did I stop treating my own life as something I was building and start treating it as something happening to me? Not rhetorically, not as a journal prompt, as a forensic question, with the same cold, clear attention Machiavelli brought to everything he observed. There will be a specific moment, a specific trade, a specific version of a small yes that started a chain. When you find it, and you will find it if you look without flinching, you won't feel liberated. You'll feel something closer to grief. That grief is important. It means you're seeing it clearly for the first time. Machiavelli didn't write The Prince for princes. He wrote it from men who had forgotten they were capable of principled action. He wrote it from a desk in a farmhouse outside Florence, stripped of every title and credential, dressed in common clothes during the day and in formal robes at night, because he said the act of writing required him to inhabit the fullness of what he understood. He dressed for the life he was thinking, even when no one was watching. That's not a metaphor for success. That's the only real definition of integrity that survives contact with reality. The people who stop selling their lives aren't the ones who suddenly get braver, luckier, or more disciplined. They're the ones who looked honestly at the pattern and refused to explain it away one more time. What was the first decision you dressed up as patience? Drop it in the comments, not as a confession, as an inventory, because naming it is the only thing that interrupts the chain.